The lightning split the New Mexico sky like a jagged scar, illuminating the desperate face of Chief Thomas Blackhorse as he pounded on Sarah Mitchell's cabin door. Behind him, the storm unleashed its fury across the desert, but nothing could match the terror in his voice when he shouted through the howling wind, "My wife, the baby comes now. You are our only hope." What happened next would transform a disgraced doctor into a legend and forge an unbreakable bond between two worlds that had never trusted each other. This is the story of how one woman's greatest failure became her most sacred calling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and regret as Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway of her isolated cabin, watching the sun dip behind the crimson cliffs of Canyon Valley. 3 years had passed since she'd fled Cedar Ridge in disgrace, and still the memories haunted her like ghosts in the gathering dusk. The once respected physician had built this sanctuary 15 miles from the nearest soul, where the only sounds were her own footsteps and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah's hands, once steady enough to perform the most delicate surgeries, now trembled as she lifted her evening cup of coffee. The tremor wasn't from age. At 32, she should have been in her prime, but from the weight of carrying a secret that had destroyed everything she'd worked for. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been Cedar Ridge's first and only female physician, a woman who'd fought tooth and nail to earn her medical degree back east before returning to serve the frontier community that had raised her. She delivered dozens of babies, treated gunshot wounds, and saved lives that other doctors had given up on. But none of that mattered anymore. Not since the night when her exhaustion and a moment's hesitation had cost the life of Judge Hammond's newborn son. The medical board had stripped her license faster than a desert wildfire, and the townsfolk who had once praised her skills now whispered her name like a curse. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her downfall had come during a childbirth, the very thing she'd always excelled at. But grief and guilt had a way of poisoning even the sweetest memories. Her cabin was sparse but functional, equipped with the basic medical supplies she'd managed to salvage before leaving town. Old habits died hard, and Sarah found herself constantly checking her instruments, organizing her bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid, as if maintaining her medical kit could somehow restore her purpose. The books that lined her shelves, Gray's Anatomy, Obstetrics and Gynecology, Principles of Surgery, served as painful reminders of the woman she used to be. The isolation had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. Her auburn hair, once carefully pinned in the professional style expected of a lady doctor, now hung loose around her shoulders. The starched white coats had been replaced by simple cotton dresses and worn leather boots suitable for the solitary life she'd chosen. She'd grown accustomed to talking to herself, narrating her daily routines to fill the oppressive silence that sometimes threatened to swallow her whole. Sarah had chosen this particular location with deliberate care. The cabin sat on a natural shelf of rock overlooking the valley, providing clear sightlines in all directions while remaining hidden from casual travelers. A natural spring provided fresh water year-round, and the overhanging cliff protected her home from the worst of the weather. More importantly, the nearest Apache reservation was a full day's ride to the southeast, and the hostile relationship between the tribal people and white settlers meant she was unlikely to encounter anyone who might recognize her. The Mescalero Apache had been relocated to their designated lands just 5 years prior, a political solution that satisfied neither the displaced tribal families nor the white settlers who viewed their new neighbors with suspicion and fear. Sarah had heard stories in town about Chief Thomas Blackhorse, a young leader trying to navigate the impossible balance between preserving his people's traditions and adapting to the new reality imposed by the territorial government. She'd also heard whispers about the sacred springs that lay somewhere in the wilderness between her cabin and the reservation, places where the Apache people had performed healing ceremonies for generations. As the weeks turned to months and the months to years, Sarah had established a routine that kept her body busy while her mind struggled to find peace. She tended a small garden that provided vegetables to supplement the supplies she purchased during infrequent trips to the trading post. She taught herself to hunt small game with an old rifle, though she was still a poor shot compared to the frontiersmen who'd grown up with weapons in their hands. Her medical knowledge proved useful in treating her own minor injuries and ailments, but she was always careful to avoid any situation that might require her to practice medicine on another human being. The guilt was a constant companion, sitting on her shoulder like a vulture waiting for carrion. Every morning brought the same questions. Could she have saved the Hammond baby if she'd been more rested? If she'd trusted her instincts instead of second-guessing herself? If she'd called for assistance sooner? The questions had no answers, only the endless loop of self-recrimination that had driven her to this self-imposed exile. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams where tiny hands slipped from her grasp and accusatory voices echoed through darkened delivery rooms. Sarah had tried everything to quiet the nightmares: chamomile tea, laudanum in carefully measured doses. Even the breathing exercises she'd learned from a traveling Eastern mystic who'd passed through Cedar Ridge years ago. Nothing worked for long. The ghosts of her failures were patient and persistent, always waiting in the shadows of her consciousness. The changing seasons marked time in her isolated world. Spring brought wildflowers that painted the valley floor, in brilliant yellows and purples, reminding her of the medicinal herbs she'd once gathered for her practice. Summer scorched the landscape with heat that shimmered off the red rocks like visible prayer, forcing her to adjust her routines to avoid the brutal midday sun. Autumn painted the cottonwoods in shades of gold that reminded her of her mother's. Hair and winter brought a stark beauty that matched the coldness she felt in her heart. It was during one of these seasonal transitions, as summer gave way to the cooler temperatures of early fall, that Sarah first noticed the signs of unusual weather patterns. The morning sky held a peculiar cast, a greenish tinge that old-timers said meant trouble was brewing. The wind shifted directions more frequently than usual, carrying unfamiliar scents from the desert floor. Her arthritis, a souvenir from a childhood fall that had never properly healed, ached with an intensity that usually preceded significant storms. Sarah had lived on the frontier long enough to respect the power of weather. She'd seen flash, floods carve new canyons in a matter of hours, and lightning strikes that could split a tree down to its roots. The isolation that usually protected her from human contact could become a deadly trap if severe weather struck without warning. She began making preparations, checking her food stores and ensuring her cabin was as secure as possible against high winds and driving rain. The animals seemed to sense the approaching disturbance as well. The hawks that usually circled lazily overhead disappeared entirely, seeking shelter in whatever hidden places they knew. The few deer that occasionally ventured near her cabin to drink from the spring became skittish and alert, their ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds that Sarah's human senses couldn't detect. Even the insects seemed affected, with the usual evening chorus of crickets and cicadas falling unusually silent. As the day progressed, the atmospheric pressure dropped noticeably, creating an oppressive feeling that made Sarah's head throb, and her thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. She found herself checking and rechecking her supplies, organizing her medical kit with an obsessive attention to detail that she recognized as a coping mechanism for anxiety. The familiar ritual of inventorying bandages, sutures, and medications helped calm her nerves, even though she had no intention of using them on anyone but herself. The horizon darkened steadily throughout the afternoon, with towering thunderheads building like massive fortresses in the distance. Sarah watched their approach from her cabin window, fascinated despite her apprehension by the raw power of nature preparing to unleash itself across the desert landscape. Lightning flickered within the cloud formations, still too distant to hear the accompanying thunder, but close enough to cast eerie shadows that danced across the valley floor. By evening, the first drops of rain began to fall, each one fat and heavy with the promise of more to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah secured her shutters and reinforced the door, knowing that desert storms could turn violent with little warning. She lit her oil lamp and settled into her rocking chair with a medical journal, trying to distract herself from the growing intensity of the wind howling around her cabin. The storm arrived with the fury of a living thing, shaking the sturdy log walls and sending rain against the windows like handfuls of thrown pebbles. Sarah had weathered many storms in her isolated refuge, but something about this one felt different, more personal, as if the universe itself was preparing to test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Little did she know that before the night was over, everything she thought she knew about her exile would be shattered by a desperate pounding on her door, and a plea that would drag her back into the world she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The pounding on Sarah's door came at the height of the storm, each thunderous knock competing with the crash of lightning that split the night sky. For a moment, she thought it might be a branch thrown against her cabin by the howling wind. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too human, too desperate. Sarah froze in her rocking chair, her medical journal sliding from her lap to the floor as fear and confusion warred in her chest. 3 years of solitude had taught her to be cautious about unexpected visitors, the few travelers who might stumble. Across her remote cabin were usually lost prospectors or cattle rustlers seeking shelter, neither group she particularly wanted to encounter alone in the wilderness. But this pounding carried an urgency that cut through her caution like a scalpel through skin. "Please!" The voice barely penetrated the storm's fury, but Sarah caught the desperation in that single word. "Help us! My wife! The baby!" Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Of all the emergencies that could arrive at her door in the middle of a desert storm, this was the one she was least prepared to face. The memories of Judge Hammond's stillborn son crashed over her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands began to shake so violently that she had to grip the arms of her chair to steady herself. The pounding resumed, more frantic now, accompanied by words in a language she didn't recognize, but whose meaning was unmistakable in its desperation. Sarah forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her as she approached the door. Through the thick wood, she could hear a man's voice alternating between English and what she assumed was Apache, pleading with a raw emotion that transcended language barriers. "Dr. Mitchell, I know you are in there. My wife needs help. The baby will not come." The use of her former title hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone knew who she was, knew what she had been before her disgrace. The careful anonymity she'd built around her exile crumbled in an instant, replaced by a terror that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside and everything to do with the storm of memories raging within her own mind. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door, fighting the urge to simply pretend she wasn't home. But the pleading continued, and beneath the man's desperate words, she began to hear something else. A woman's voice, weak but audible, crying out in pain. The sound struck her with the force of revelation. There was a laboring woman somewhere out in this storm, and she might be the only person within miles who possessed the knowledge to help her. With trembling fingers, Sarah unlatched the door and pulled it open just wide enough to peer out into the night. Lightning, illuminated the scene like a photographer's flash, revealing a sight that would be burned into her memory forever. A tall Apache man stood on her doorstep, his long black hair plastered to his head by the driving rain, his face etched with panic and exhaustion. In his arms, he carried a young woman whose swollen belly left no doubt about her condition. Behind them, partially sheltered under the overhang of Sarah's porch, stood several other figures, Apache men and women whose faces reflected the same desperate hope and barely contained fear. The woman in the man's arms let out another cry of pain, and Sarah saw her back arch with the unmistakable rhythm of hard labor contractions. "You are the doctor," the man said, his English accented but clear. "Thomas Blackhorse told me you live here. My name is Daniel Swift Arrow. This is Maria, wife of our chief. The storm caught us traveling to the sacred springs for the birth ceremony. Her time has come, but something is wrong." Sarah's mind reeled as she processed this information. Chief Thomas Blackhorse's wife was in labor on her doorstep during the worst storm she'd witnessed in years, and somehow they knew exactly who she was and where to find her. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet here they were, drenched and desperate, looking to her for salvation she wasn't certain she could provide. I can't," Sarah began, but her words were cut off by Maria's sharp cry of pain. The sound pierced through Sarah's defenses like nothing else could have, awakening instincts that 3 years of self-imposed exile hadn't been able to completely bury. Without conscious thought, she found herself stepping back and opening the doctor wider. "Bring her inside," she heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Quickly, before you all catch your death in this storm." The Apache group moved with efficient coordination that spoke of deep familiarity with emergency situations. Daniel Swift Arrow carried Maria across the threshold with infinite care, while the other tribal members followed, shaking rain from their clothes and looking around Sarah's modest cabin with curious but respectful eyes. The small space suddenly felt impossibly crowded, filled with the scent of wet leather and sage smoke that seemed to cling to their clothes. Sarah directed them to carry Maria to her bed, the only flat surface in the cabin large enough to accommodate a laboring woman. As Daniel gently laid the chief's wife on Sarah's quilted coverlet, the reality of the situation began to sink in fully. She was about to attempt to deliver a baby, the very thing that had destroyed her life and career, for people who had no other options and nowhere else to turn. Maria Blackhorse was younger than Sarah had initially thought, probably no more than 20, with the kind of classical beauty that reminded Sarah of the Spanish missionaries' paintings of the Virgin Mary. Her face was drawn with pain and exhaustion, but her dark eyes held an inner strength that spoke of a woman accustomed to enduring hardship. When she looked at Sarah, there was no judgment or suspicion in her gaze, only the desperate hope of a mother who needed help bringing her child into the world. "How long has she been in labor?" Sarah asked, forcing herself to slip back into the professional demeanor she'd cultivated during her years of practice. The familiar routine of gathering information helped steady her nerves and quiet the voices of doubt that screamed in her head. "Since before sunrise," replied an older Apache woman who had remained close to Maria's side. "The pains were gentle at first, as they should be, but they have grown stronger and more frequent as the day passed. When the storm came, we sought shelter, but the baby seems determined to arrive tonight." Sarah nodded, her hands already moving to check Maria's pulse and assess her general condition. The young woman's heartbeat was strong but rapid, her skin flushed with fever and exertion. When another contraction hit, Sarah watched carefully, noting the way Maria's entire body tensed and the duration of the pain. Everything she observed suggested a normal labor that was progressing as it should, but Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Something is wrong. What makes you think there's a problem? Sarah asked, directing her question to Daniel but keeping her hands busy with her examination. The baby should have come by now, the older woman answered instead. I have helped bring many children into this world, and I know the signs. This little one is being stubborn, or perhaps the position is not right. Sarah's heart sank as she began to understand the situation. A prolonged labor could indicate several complications, most of them requiring the kind of intervention that had gone so disastrously wrong 3 years ago. Her hands began to shake again as she prepared to conduct a more thorough examination, the memories of her failure threatening to overwhelm her professional instincts. But before she could retreat into panic, Maria reached out and grasped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. The young Apache woman's eyes were clear and determined, despite her pain, and when she spoke, her words were in heavily accented but unmistakable English. Please, she whispered, help my baby. I know you are afraid, but fear will not save us now. Only your knowledge can do that. The simple directness of Maria's plea cut through Sarah's emotional turmoil like a beacon through fog. This woman somehow knew about her past, about her failure, yet she was still asking for help. There was no condemnation in her voice, no demand for guarantees Sarah couldn't give, just a mother's desperate love and faith that Sarah might be able to do what needed to be done. Sarah looked around the cabin at the assembled faces watching her with varying degrees of hope and concern. These people had traveled through a dangerous storm to reach her, had somehow learned her identity and location, had brought their most precious responsibility to her door. The weight of their trust was simultaneously terrifying and strangely liberating. I'll need clean water, Sarah said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. Lots of it. And I'll need you to help me move some furniture to give us more room to work. And part 3, the examination. The transformation of Sarah's cabin from peaceful refuge to makeshift delivery room happened with remarkable speed and efficiency. The Apache women seemed to understand instinctively what was needed, working together to rearrange furniture and prepare the space while the men stepped outside to tend to their horses and give the women privacy for the medical examination that would determine the course of action. Sarah found herself oddly comforted by their presence and competence. During her years of practice in Cedar Ridge, she had often worked alone, explaining procedures to nervous husbands and anxious relatives who seemed more hindrance than help. But these women moved with the confidence of people who had attended many births, understanding, without being told, that clean linens were needed, that water should be heated, that certain herbs might be beneficial. The older woman who had spoken earlier introduced herself as Elena Morningstar, Maria's aunt and the tribe's most experienced midwife. Her weathered hands and calm demeanor spoke of decades of experience in helping babies enter the world, and Sarah felt a measure of relief, knowing that she wouldn't be working entirely alone. In our tradition, Elena explained as she helped Sarah gather her medical supplies, birth is a sacred act that connects the mother to all the women who came before her. We believe that each child chooses the time and manner of their arrival, but sometimes they need encouragement to complete their journey. Sarah nodded, appreciating both the cultural context and the practical wisdom in Elena's words. She had always believed that successful childbirth required a partnership between medical knowledge and natural instinct, and it seemed the Apache people understood this balance as well as any formally trained physician. As Sarah prepared for the examination, Maria's contractions continued with increasing intensity. The young woman handled each wave of pain with remarkable composure, breathing deeply and maintaining eye contact with Sarah in a way that conveyed both trust and determination. It was clear that Maria Blackhorse possessed the inner strength necessary for childbirth, but strength alone wouldn't be enough if there were complications requiring medical intervention. Sarah washed her hands thoroughly with carbolic acid solution, a practice that many frontier doctors still considered unnecessary, but one that her medical training had convinced her was crucial for preventing infection. Elena watched this ritual with interest, nodding approvingly at Sarah's attention to cleanliness. "You prepare as our medicine men do before ceremony," Elena observed. "Purification of the hands and heart before touching sacred life." The comparison struck Sarah as both beautiful and appropriate. She had always approached childbirth with a sense of reverence for the miracle she was witnessing. But Elena's words reminded her that this wasn't merely a medical procedure, but a spiritual event that deserved the highest level of respect and care. When Sarah began her examination, she immediately understood why Daniel and Elena had been concerned. The baby was indeed in an awkward position, with the head not properly aligned for a normal delivery. This type of malpresentation was exactly the kind of complication that required skilled intervention, the kind of situation where a moment's hesitation or poor judgment could result in tragedy for both mother and child. Sarah's hands moved carefully as she assessed the situation, her training taking over despite the emotional turmoil churning in her chest. The baby was large and strong. She could feel the steady heartbeat and active movement that indicated a healthy child, but the positioning would make a natural delivery extremely difficult, if not impossible. "The baby is lying crosswise," Sarah explained to Elena, using terms she hoped would translate clearly. "Instead of head down, ready to emerge, the baby is sideways across the birth canal. This is why the labor has been so long without progress." Eleanor's face creases with understanding and concern. "In our language, we call this the child who cannot find the path. It is not uncommon, but it requires great skill to guide the baby to the proper position." Sarah felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. The procedure Elena was describing, external version, was one she had performed successfully several times during her practice, but it was also inherently risky. If done incorrectly, it could cause the umbilical cord to wrap around the baby's neck or create other complications potentially fatal to both mother and child. Another strong contraction. It gripped Maria, and Sarah watched as the young woman's face contorted with pain that seemed more intense than what she had observed earlier. The baby's awkward position was putting additional strain on Maria's body, and Sarah knew that prolonged labor of this type could exhaust the mother to the point where she lacked the strength necessary for the final stages of delivery. "How long can she continue like this?" Sarah asked Elena, hoping the experienced midwife might have insights that her medical textbooks couldn't provide. "Not much longer," Elena replied honestly. "I have seen strong women weaken and fade when the birth path is blocked. If the baby cannot be turned soon, we may lose them both." The stark reality of Elena's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Once again, she found herself in the exact situation that had destroyed her career and her confidence. A complicated birth, a mother and baby in danger, and the terrible weight of responsibility for making the right decision under pressure. But as Sarah looked at Maria's face, she saw something that had been absent from her previous traumatic experience. Judge Hammond's wife had been terrified and hysterical, screaming accusations and demands that had made it impossible for Sarah to think clearly or work effectively. Maria, despite her obvious pain, remained calm and focused, her eyes conveying complete trust in Sarah's abilities. "What do you need us to do?" Elena asked simply, recognizing that Sarah was weighing a difficult decision. "I need to attempt to turn the baby," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's a delicate procedure that requires precise timing and gentle pressure. If I can encourage the baby to shift into the proper position, labor should progress normally. But if something goes wrong..." "Nothing will go wrong," Maria said softly, reaching for Sarah's hand. "The spirits brought you to this place for this moment. Trust in your knowledge and in the wisdom of generations of women who have walked this path before you." Sarah squeezed Maria's hand, drawing strength from the young woman's unwavering faith. Around them, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, a different kind of energy was building. The focused determination of women working together to bring new life into the world. "Elena, I'll need you to help hold Maria steady during the procedure," Sarah instructed, "and we'll need the other women to prepare for immediate delivery once the baby turns. If this works, things could happen very quickly after that." As Sarah positioned herself and prepared to attempt the external version, she felt the familiar surge of focus that had always accompanied her most challenging medical procedures. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness, but it was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving Cedar Ridge. Maria's next contraction provided the opportunity Sarah had been waiting for. As the young woman's muscles relaxed between pains, Sarah placed her hands on either side of the protruding belly and began the delicate process of encouraging the baby to shift position. The technique required a perfect balance of firmness and gentleness, applying just enough pressure to guide the baby's movement without causing trauma or distress. For several tense minutes, Sarah worked with intense concentration, feeling for the baby's response to her manipulations and adjusting her approach based on what she sensed through her fingertips. Eleanor watched with fascination, occasionally offering encouragement or asking questions about the technique that demonstrated her genuine interest in learning. Then, as suddenly as a door opening, Sarah felt the baby shift. The change was unmistakable. The hard knot of the baby's head moved downward, while the rest of the body rotated into proper alignment. A collective sigh of relief filled the cabin, as everyone present recognized that something significant had just occurred. "The baby has turned," Sarah announced, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. "The next few contractions should show us whether we've solved the problem." They didn't have to wait long. Maria's next contraction was noticeably different, more productive, with visible progress as the baby began its proper descent through the birth canal. The change in Maria's expression was immediate and obvious. The pain was still intense, but it now had purpose and direction. "Now the real work begins," Elena said with a smile, moving to prepare the final supplies they would need for delivery. "The path is clear, but the journey is not yet complete." As Part 4, the sacred birth, the next phase of Maria's labor unfolded, with the natural rhythm that Sarah remembered from her most successful deliveries. With the baby properly positioned, each contraction brought visible progress, and Maria's strength seemed to return as she sensed that her child was finally ready to enter the world. The storm outside provided a dramatic backdrop, but inside the cabin there was an atmosphere of focused calm that spoke to the sacred nature of the event taking place. Sarah found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of monitoring and encouraging, her hands and voice working together to guide Maria through the intense final stages of labor. Elena proved to be an invaluable assistant, anticipating Sarah's needs and providing the kind of emotional support that only another woman who had given birth could offer. "Breathe with the pain, not against it," Elena coached Maria during a particularly strong contraction. "Your body knows what to do. Trust in the wisdom that has brought countless children into this world." The other Apache women had arranged themselves around the room in what Sarah gradually realized was a deliberate pattern. They weren't simply observers, but participants in a ceremony that transcended the purely medical aspects of childbirth. Their quiet chanting, barely audible above the storm, created a sense of spiritual presence that Sarah found both foreign and deeply moving. "In our tradition," Eleanor explained during a brief lull between contractions, Birth is attended not only by the living, but by the spirits of all the mothers who have gone before. We believe they guide the baby's spirit from the world beyond into this world of flesh and breath. Sarah nodded, finding unexpected comfort in this belief. During her years of medical practice, she had always felt that there was something almost mystical about the moment when a new life emerged into the world, something that couldn't be fully explained by scientific knowledge alone. The Apache women's frank acknowledgement of this mystery felt more honest than the purely clinical approach she had been trained to maintain. As Maria's labor progressed, Sarah began to notice subtle signs that suggested this birth might be even more significant than she had initially realized. The baby seemed unusually large and strong, with a heartbeat that remained steady and powerful, even during the most intense contractions. Maria herself displayed a remarkable resilience, drawing on reserves of strength that seemed almost supernatural. "This child will be special," Elena murmured during one of her examinations. "I can feel the power in the mother's body, the strength in the baby's spirit. This is a child born to leadership, born to bridge worlds." Sarah might have dismissed such pronouncements as superstition if she hadn't been witness to the extraordinary nature of everything that had transpired that night. The storm that had brought these people to her door, the precision with which they had found her isolated cabin, the way her own fears had been overcome by the urgent need to help. All of it seemed orchestrated by forces beyond normal coincidence. The final stage of labor began with a contraction so powerful that Maria cried out for the first time since entering the cabin. Sarah could see the baby's head beginning to crown, dark hair wet with birth fluids, but unmistakably healthy and strong. The sight brought back a flood of memories from successful deliveries in her past, reminding her of the joy and satisfaction that had originally drawn her to medicine. "I can see the head," Sarah announced, her voice filled with excitement despite her efforts to maintain professional composure. "A few more contractions and we'll have a baby." The Apache women's chanting grew slightly louder, and Sarah caught fragments of words that seemed to be calling upon various spirits and ancestors to bless the emerging child. She found the ritual surprisingly comforting rather than distracting, as if the collective spiritual energy in the room was providing additional support for both mother and baby. Maria's next push brought the baby's head fully into view, and Sarah carefully supported the emerging infant while checking to ensure that the umbilical cord wasn't wrapped around the neck. Everything appeared normal and healthy, and she felt a surge of confidence that had been absent from her medical practice for years. "One more big push, Maria," Sarah encouraged. "Your baby is almost here." With a final effort that seemed to draw on every reserve of strength in her body, Maria bore down with determination that was both fierce and beautiful to witness. The ICU baby's shoulders rotated smoothly, and then suddenly the entire infant was sliding into Sarah's waiting hands, slippery, warm, and unmistakably alive. The baby's first cry pierced the air like a trumpet announcing royalty, strong and clear and filled with the indignant outrage of a child who had found the journey from womb to world more challenging than expected. Sarah found herself laughing with pure joy as she lifted the squalling infant and placed him on Maria's chest. "A son," she announced unnecessarily, since the baby's gender was obvious to everyone present. A beautiful, healthy son. The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. The chanting stopped, replaced by exclamations of joy and wonder in both Apache and English. Maria's exhausted face was transfigured by a smile of such pure happiness that Sarah felt tears spring to her own eyes. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was acknowledging the significance of this new life. Elena moved quickly, to help clean and examine the baby, while Sarah delivered the placenta and tended to Maria's immediate post-birth needs. The infant was indeed large and robust, with the kind of lusty cry and strong grip that indicated excellent health and vitality. His skin had the golden tone that spoke of his mixed Apache and possibly Hispanic heritage, and his thick black hair was already showing signs of curl. "He is perfect," Maria whispered, cradling her son against her chest. "Strong like his father, but gentle like the spring rain." As Sarah worked to ensure that both mother and baby were stable and comfortable, she became aware of a growing sense of completion that went far beyond the successful conclusion of a difficult delivery. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of her medical failure like a stone in her chest, convinced that she was fundamentally flawed as a healer. But tonight, surrounded by women who had trusted her with their most precious responsibility, she had rediscovered not only her skill, but her purpose. The baby's cries gradually subsided as he settled into his mother's arms, and Sarah found herself studying his small features with the kind of wonder she had almost forgotten was possible. Every successful birth had been a miracle, but this one felt different, more personal, more meaningful, more like a gift she had been given rather than a service she had provided. Elena approached Sarah with the expression of deep respect and gratitude that made the older woman appear almost reverent. "You have given us a great gift tonight," she said solemnly. "Not just the safe delivery of this child, but the blessing of your skill and courage when we needed them most." Sarah felt a flush of pride that was quickly tempered by humility. "I only did what any competent physician would have done. You and Maria did all the real work." "No," Elena replied firmly. "You did much more than provide medical care. You welcomed strangers into your home during a storm. You overcame your own fears to help people you had never met. You treated us with respect and worked alongside our traditions rather than dismissing them. These are the actions of a true healer, not merely a physician." The distinction Elena was drawing struck Sarah as both important and profound. During her years of practice in Cedar Ridge, she had focused primarily on the technical aspects of medicine, viewing herself as a practitioner of scientific knowledge rather than a healer in the broader sense. But tonight, she had been forced to integrate not only her medical training, but her intuition, her compassion, and her ability to work within a cultural framework very different from her own. As the immediate crisis passed and everyone began to relax, Sarah became aware that the storm outside was beginning to subside. The wind was still strong, but the lightning had moved off toward the eastern mountains, and the drumming of rain on her roof had settled into a gentler rhythm. It seemed fitting that the weather should calm just as the drama inside her cabin was reaching its peaceful conclusion. The baby had settled into the contented drowsiness that typically followed the exhaustion of birth. His tiny fist curled against his mother's breast as he instinctively sought nourishment. Maria looked tired but radiant, her face glowing with the unique combination of exhaustion and exhilaration that Sarah had observed in countless new mothers over the years. "What will you name him?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Apache naming traditions. Maria and Elena exchanged a meaningful look before Elena answered. "In our tradition, a child receives several names throughout their life. The birth name, the childhood name, the adult name chosen during ceremony. But this child was born during a great storm, delivered by a woman who came to us like an answer to prayer. His birth name will reflect these sacred circumstances." Sarah felt honored to be included in such an important cultural decision, even if she didn't fully understand all the implications. The idea that her presence might be considered sacred rather than simply fortuitous was both humbling and deeply moving. As the night wore on and both mother and baby rested peacefully, Sarah found herself in quiet conversation with Elena about the events that had brought them all together. The older woman's explanations helped Sarah understand that their arrival at her cabin had been far from accidental. "Chief Blackhorse has known of your presence here for many months," Elena revealed. "Our scouts are aware of all who live within the boundaries of our traditional lands." When Maria's time approached, and she expressed the desire to give birth at the sacred springs, the chief made inquiries about what help might be available if complications arose. Sarah was surprised by this revelation. She had assumed her isolation was complete, but apparently the Apache had been quietly aware of her presence all along. The thought should have been disturbing, but instead she found it oddly comforting to know that she hadn't been as alone as she had believed. "Why didn't he approach me directly?" Sarah asked. "If he knew I was a doctor." Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "Our people have learned to be cautious about trusting white medicine and white doctors, but the chief also knew about your difficulties in Cedar Ridge. He felt that a woman who had experienced her own healing journey might understand the sacred nature of birth in ways that other doctors might not." The insight was both perceptive and generous, suggesting that Chief Blackhorse had understood her exile not as a sign of incompetence, but as a kind of spiritual preparation for this very moment. The idea that her lowest point might have been preparation for her highest calling was almost too profound to fully grasp. Part 5. The recognition dawn was breaking over the red cliffs of Canyon Valley when the cabin door opened and Chief Thomas Blackhorse himself stepped across the threshold. Sarah had been dozing lightly in her rocking chair, keeping one ear attuned to the sounds of mother and baby while allowing herself the first real rest she'd had since the previous evening. The sight of the Apache leader, tall and imposing even, in his obvious exhaustion, brought her instantly awake and alert. Thomas Blackhorse was younger than Sarah had expected, probably no more than 30, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His long black hair was streaked with rain, and his traditional clothing was still damp from the storm. But there was a dignity in his bearing that spoke of natural leadership and deep inner strength. When his eyes fell on his wife and newborn son, Sarah witnessed a transformation that reminded her why she had originally chosen medicine as her calling. The fierce, weathered features of a tribal leader softened into those of a young father seeing his child for the first time. Maria stirred at the sound of his entry and looked up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire cabin. Without a word, Thomas crossed to the bed and knelt beside his family, his large hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch his son's tiny fingers. "He is beautiful," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "strong and perfect, like his mother." Maria's eyes sparkled with tired joy as she shifted to make room for her husband beside her on the narrow bed. Sarah delivered him safely, even though the storm made everything difficult. She was fearless and skilled, exactly what we needed. Sarah felt a familiar flush of embarrassment at the praise, but this time it was tempered by a growing sense of genuine pride in what had been accomplished. The successful delivery had been a team effort involving not only her medical knowledge, but Eleanor's experience, Maria's courage, and the spiritual support of the entire Apache group. Thomas Blackhorse turned to face Sarah directly, and she found herself subjected to the kind of scrutiny that seemed to see far beyond surface appearances. His dark eyes held intelligence, wisdom, and a depth of understanding that reminded her that leadership among his people was earned rather than inherited. "Dr. Mitchell," he said formally, rising to his full height, "my family and my people owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. You welcomed us in our time of greatest need, and you used your skills to ensure the safe arrival of my son. This is a gift that will be remembered for generations." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the solemnity of his words and the obvious sincerity behind them. "I only did what any doctor would have done, Chief Blackhorse. Your wife did all the hard work, and Elena provided invaluable assistance. I was just fortunate to be here when you needed help." Thomas shook his head slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You are too modest, Doctor. Elena has told me of the skill required to turn the baby, of the calm confidence you showed even when the situation was most dangerous. These are not the actions of any doctor, but of a true healer." The conversation was interrupted by the baby's awakening, announced by the kind of lusty cry that indicated both health and hunger. Maria began the process of nursing her son, a sight so natural and beautiful that Sarah felt her eyes filling with tears she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or relief, or simply the overwhelming emotion of witnessing the continuation of life in its most fundamental form. Elena approached Sarah with a steaming cup of what appeared to be herbal tea, its aroma rich with unfamiliar but pleasant scents. "Drink this," she encouraged. "It will restore your strength and help you understand what has truly happened here tonight." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully, surprised by how thoroughly drained she felt now that the immediate crisis had passed. The tea was unlike anything she had tasted before, with complex flavors that seemed to include sage, pine, and other herbs she couldn't identify. Whatever the ingredients, she felt an almost immediate sense of warmth and clarity spreading through her tired body. "What's in this?" she asked Elena, genuinely curious about the medicinal properties of the brew. "Herbs that our medicine women have used for generations to restore balance after sacred ceremonies," Elena replied. "Birth is one of our most sacred events, and those who assist in bringing new life into the world are honored accordingly." Thomas had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest, and now he stepped forward with an expression of deep seriousness. "Dr. Mitchell, there is something important I must discuss with you, something that goes beyond tonight's events." Sarah felt a flutter of apprehension, uncertain what the chief might want to discuss, but sensing that it would be significant. "Of course, Chief Blackhorse. What can I do for you?" "What you have done tonight, the skill, the courage, the respect for our ways, these are the qualities of someone who could serve as a bridge between our peoples. My tribe has great need for medical knowledge, especially for our women and children. We would be honored if you would consider working with us, combining your training with our traditional healing practices." Ndut, the proposal struck Sarah speechless. After 3 years of self-imposed exile, convinced that her medical career was over forever, she was being offered not just a chance to practice medicine again, but to do so in a way that seemed meaningful and important. The idea of combining Western medical knowledge with Apache healing traditions was both exciting and daunting. I don't know what to say," Sarah stammered. "It's an honor even to be asked, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for such a responsibility. My past—" "Your past has prepared you for this moment," Thomas interrupted gently. "Elena has told me that you worked within our traditions tonight rather than dismissing them, that you showed respect for our beliefs while using your own knowledge. This is exactly the kind of partnership our people need." Elena nodded in agreement. "The spirits brought you to this place, gave you the skills needed to save Maria and the baby, and opened your heart to understanding our ways. These are not accidents, but signs that you are meant for this work." Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces watching her with expressions of hope and encouragement. These people had trusted her with their most precious responsibility, and were now offering her something she had thought lost forever: the chance to be a healer again, to use her skills in service of others who truly needed her. The baby's contented murmuring as he nursed provided a gentle soundtrack to Sarah's internal struggle. The successful delivery had proven to herself that her skills were intact, that the confidence-destroying failure in Cedar Ridge had been an anomaly rather than a revelation of fundamental incompetence. But more than that, working alongside Elena and the other Apache women had shown her a different model of what it meant to be a healer. "If I were to accept," Sarah said slowly, "what would be expected of me? I have much to learn about your peoples, ways, and I wouldn't want to inadvertently cause offense or disruption." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his serious features and making him appear much younger. "You would be expected to learn, as we would be expected to teach. You would be expected to share your knowledge, as we would share ours. Most importantly, you would be expected to approach our partnership with the same respect and openness you have shown tonight. And there would be no conflict with territorial authorities, no problems with my irregular status as a physician. On reservation land, we govern ourselves according to our own laws and traditions," Thomas replied firmly. "Your past difficulties with white man's medicine boards have no bearing on your ability to serve our people. We judge healers by their results, not by the opinions of distant officials who have never witnessed their work." The freedom implied in his words was almost overwhelming. For 3 years, Sarah had lived with the shame of her professional disgrace, convinced that her medical career was permanently destroyed. The possibility of practicing medicine again, of using her skills to help people who genuinely needed and appreciated her abilities, was like being offered a chance at redemption. But even more appealing was the opportunity to learn from Eleanor and the other traditional healers, to explore the integration of different healing approaches, and to be part of a community that viewed medicine as sacred rather than merely technical. The isolation that had been both her punishment and her protection could be replaced by meaningful work and genuine human connection. "I need time to think about this." Sarah found herself walking along the edge of the spring behind her cabin as the morning sun climbed higher over the canyon walls. The events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike in the clear light of day, but the evidence was undeniable. Her cabin still held the lingering scents of birth and healing herbs, and the sounds of quiet conversation in Apache and English drifted through her open windows. The offer Chief Blackhorse had made continued to circle through her mind like a persistent melody. After years of believing her medical career was finished, the possibility of not only practicing again, but doing so as part of something larger and more meaningful seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the sincerity in Thomas's voice and the respect she had witnessed in Elena's eyes suggested that this was no casual proposition born of momentary gratitude. Sarah's reflection was interrupted by the approach of Elena, who moved with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to walking in harmony with the natural world. The older woman carried 2 cups of the same herbal tea she had prepared earlier, steam rising from their surfaces in the cool morning air. "Thought you might need this," Elena said, offering one of the cups with a gentle smile. "Decisions of the heart require nourishment of the spirit." Sarah accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the complex aroma that had become associated in her mind with the previous night's extraordinary events. "Eleanor, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. After what we shared last night, there should be no barriers between us. How long have you been a midwife? What called you to this work?" Elena settled onto a smooth boulder beside the spring, her weathered hands cradling her cup as she gazed across the water. "I was very young when I lost my first child during birth. The pain nearly destroyed me, but an old medicine woman told me that sometimes our greatest wounds become the source of our greatest healing power. She taught me that those who have walked through the valley of loss can guide others safely across. The parallel to Sarah's own experience was unmistakable, and she felt a deep recognition of the truth in Elena's words. Did you ever doubt yourself? After losing your child, were you afraid to attend other births? Terrified, Elena admitted without hesitation. For months, I could barely look at pregnant women without feeling sick with fear. But the old woman was wise. She made me assist at easy births first, then gradually more challenging ones, always reminding me that fear can be a teacher if we listen to its lessons without letting it become our master. Sarah sipped her tea thoughtfully, processing this wisdom. What if I'm not ready? What if my fears make me hesitate at a crucial moment? Eleanor turned to study Sarah with eyes that seemed to see far more than surface appearances. Last night, you were afraid. I could see it in your hands, hear it in your breathing. But when Maria needed you most, when the baby required your skill to find the path to life, your fear stepped aside and let your knowledge work. This is what makes a true healer. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to act correctly despite it. The insight struck Sarah with the force of revelation. She had been waiting for her confidence to return completely before considering herself fit to practice medicine again. But Eleanor was suggesting that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act appropriately in spite of it. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Daniel's swift arrow rode into view, leading several other Apache men who had apparently come to escort Maria and the baby back to the reservation. Sarah watched as they dismounted and approached her cabin with the quiet efficiency she had observed the night before. The chief's family is ready to travel, Eleanor explained. Maria is stronger than many women after birth, and the baby is robust enough for the journey home. But Thomas wishes to speak with you once more before we leave. Sarah nodded, finishing her tea before following Elena back toward the cabin. Inside, she found Maria sitting up in bed, looking remarkably well for someone who had given birth just hours earlier. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, his small face relaxed and content.
Doctor
Mitchell? Maria said as Sarah entered. I wanted to thank you personally before we leave, what you did last night. It was more than medical care. You treated us as family, welcomed us when we were strangers, showed respect for our ways. These are gifts that go far beyond the debt we owe for your skills. Sarah felt moved by the young woman's eloquence and sincerity. Maria, seeing your son born safely was reward enough. You were incredibly brave throughout the entire process. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention, even in the small space. Dr. Mitchell, have you had time to consider our discussion? Sarah took a deep breath, aware that her answer would determine the course of her future. Chief Blackhorse, I'm honored by your offer, truly, but I need to ask some practical questions before I can give you a definitive answer. Please ask whatever you need to know. Where would I live? How would the arrangement work day to day? What would be expected of me beyond medical care? Thomas smiled, apparently pleased by her practical approach. We would build you a dwelling near the village, close enough to be readily available, but with enough privacy for your own needs. You would work primarily with Elena and our other traditional healers, learning our methods while teaching yours, and you would be free to treat anyone who sought your help, not just our tribal members. Elena added, many of the Mexican families in the area have also expressed interest in having access to trained medical care. You could serve a much larger community than just our tribe. The scope of what they were describing was both exciting and intimidating. Sarah would not only be returning to medical practice, but potentially pioneering a new form of integrated healthcare that combined the best of different healing traditions. What about supplies, medical equipment? Many of the things I would need are expensive and difficult to obtain. "We have been thinking about this for some time," Thomas replied. "There are trading relationships we can utilize, and some members of our tribe have connections with suppliers in larger towns. We would consider this an investment in the health of our people." Sarah realized that their offer had been carefully thought through, rather than made impulsively in gratitude for the previous night's successful delivery. This level of planning and consideration made the proposition even more compelling. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," Sarah said, her voice growing serious. "The reason I left Cedar Ridge, the failure that ended my practice there, it involved the death of a baby during a complicated delivery. I need you to know that, to understand that despite last night's success, I carry the knowledge that I'm not infallible." Thomas and Elena exchanged a meaningful look before Elena responded. "We know about Cedar Ridge. We know about the baby who died, and we know that you carried that burden alone, with no one to help you understand that some deaths cannot be prevented, no matter how skilled the healer." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. How could you possibly know about that? "Word travels in ways that white people often don't expect," Thomas explained gently. "We made inquiries when we first learned of your presence here. We spoke to people who knew what really happened that night. People who understood that you did everything humanly possible to save both mother and child." Elena leaned forward, her voice filled with compassion. "In our tradition, we believe that healers are called to serve not despite their wounds, but because of them. The healer who has never faced loss cannot truly understand the families who come seeking help in their darkest moments." The revelation that they had known about her past all along, had understood it better than she understood it herself, was almost overwhelming. For 3 years, she had carried her failure as proof of her unworthiness to practice medicine. But these people saw it as evidence of her qualification to be a true healer. "If I accept your offer," Sarah said slowly, "I want to be completely honest about my limitations and my fears. I want to work as part of a team, not as someone who makes decisions in isolation." "That is exactly what we hoped you would say," Thomas replied with obvious satisfaction. "Healing is too important to be left to any one person, no matter how skilled. It requires the wisdom of many minds and many traditions working together." Maria shifted her baby to one arm and reached out to clasp Sarah's hand. "Please say yes. Our children need what you can offer, and I believe you need what we can offer as well." The simple directness of Maria's plea cut through all of Sarah's remaining hesitation. This young woman had trusted her with the most precious thing in her life, had shown faith in her abilities when Sarah herself had lost that faith, and was now asking her to extend that trust to an entire community. "Yes," Sarah heard herself say, the word emerging with a certainty that surprised her. "Yes, I would be honored to work with your people." The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. Thomas's stern features broke into a broad smile. Elena clapped her hands together in delight, and even Daniel's swift arrow, who had been observing silently from the doorway, nodded his approval. "When would you like me to begin?" Sarah asked, still somewhat stunned by the magnitude of the decision she had just made. "There is no hurry," Thomas assured her. "Take whatever time you need to arrange your affairs here, to prepare for the move. When you're ready, we'll be waiting." Part 7. The Transition. The weeks that followed Sarah's acceptance of Chief Blackhorse's offer passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Her simple cabin, which had been adequate for a life of solitary exile, suddenly seemed inadequate for someone preparing to resume active medical practice. She found herself taking inventory of her supplies with new eyes, assessing what could be salvaged from her old practice and what would need to be acquired fresh. Elena visited frequently during this period, ostensibly to check on Sarah's preparations, but actually serving as an invaluable source of information about Apache healing traditions and the specific medical needs of the tribal community. These conversations opened Sarah's eyes to approaches to healthcare that had never been covered in her formal medical training. Our people understand that sickness often comes from imbalance, Elena explained during one of their afternoon discussions. Physical symptoms may be treated with herbs and manipulation, but true healing requires attention to the spirit and emotions as well. Sarah found this holistic approach both fascinating and sensible. During her years of practice in Cedar Ridge, she had often observed that patients with similar physical ailments responded very differently to identical treatments, and she was beginning to understand that the differences might be related to factors her medical education had never addressed. How do you determine what type of imbalance is causing a particular illness? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the diagnostic methods Elena employed. We listen, Elena replied simply. We listen to what the patient says, but also to what they don't say. We observe their relationships, their daily habits, their connection to the natural world. Sometimes the cure for a stomach ailment is not medicine, but resolution of a family conflict. The wisdom in this approach was undeniable, and Sarah began to see how her own medical knowledge could be enhanced rather than replaced by these traditional insights. The combination of scientific understanding of anatomy and physiology with intuitive awareness of emotional and spiritual factors could create a more complete approach to healing than either system could achieve alone. As her move date approached, Sarah began receiving visitors from the Apache community who wanted to meet their new healer. These meetings were always formal and respectful, with each visitor bringing some small gift, herbs, woven goods, carved items that spoke to their hopes for the partnership ahead. One of the most memorable visits came from Rosa Stoneheart, an elderly woman who served as the tribal community's primary herbalist. Rosa spoke little English, but her expertise was evident in the careful way she examined Sarah's medical supplies and the knowing nods she gave when recognizing familiar plant-based remedies. She wants to know if you understand the difference between healing and curing, Eleanor translated after a long conversation in Apache. She says many white doctors think they are the same thing, but they are not. Sarah pondered this distinction, recognizing its importance even though she wasn't entirely certain she understood the difference. What does she mean? Curing removes symptoms, Elena explained. Healing restores harmony. Sometimes a person can be cured but not healed. Sometimes a person can be healed even when they cannot be cured. The profundity of this observation struck Sarah immediately. She had indeed been trained to focus primarily on eliminating symptoms and treating disease, but she was beginning to understand that true healing might require a much broader perspective. During her final week at the cabin, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the territorial medical supervisor who had been instrumental in the investigation that ended her career in Cedar Ridge, appeared at her door on a gray morning that threatened rain. Dr. Hayes was a man in his 50s, with the kind of rigid bearing that suggested military background and the suspicious expression of someone who viewed the frontier as a barely civilized wasteland requiring constant vigilance. His presence at Sarah's cabin was both surprising and deeply unwelcome. "Dr. Mitchell," he said formally, declining her offer to enter the cabin, "I've heard disturbing reports about your recent activities." Sarah felt her stomach clench with a familiar anxiety, but she forced herself to maintain composure. "What activities would those be, Dr. Hayes?" "Reports that you've been practicing medicine without a license, specifically attending a birth for some Apache woman. You understand that such practice is strictly forbidden, given your current status." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah realized that someone must have reported the events of the storm night, though she couldn't imagine who or why. More importantly, she understood that Dr. Hayes's visit represented a potential threat to her newfound opportunity with the Apache community. "I provided emergency assistance to a woman in labor during a severe storm," Sarah replied carefully. "She would have died without help, and I was the only person with medical knowledge available." That may be true, but it doesn't change the legal reality. You have no license to practice medicine in this territory, and engaging in medical procedures could result in criminal charges. Sarah felt a flash of the old fear and shame that had driven her into exile, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger: anger at the bureaucratic rigidity that would condemn a woman and child to death. "In the name of administrative procedure, Dr. Hayes, are you seriously suggesting that I should have let a woman and her baby die to avoid violating a regulation? I'm suggesting that you should have sent for a properly licensed physician and limited your involvement to basic first aid." The nearest licensed physician was over 50 miles away, and the storm made travel impossible. By the time help could have arrived, both mother and child would have been dead. Dr. Hayes's expression remained unmoved by this argument. "Nevertheless, you exceeded your authority and engaged in prohibited practice. I'm here to warn you that any further such incidents will result in formal charges." Sarah took a deep breath, realizing that this confrontation represented more than just a bureaucratic warning. It was a test of her commitment to her new path. "Dr. Hayes, I want to be very clear about something. If another person comes to me in medical crisis, I will help them to the best of my ability, regardless of administrative regulations. I will not let people die to satisfy the Territorial Medical Board." The defiance in her own voice surprised Sarah almost as much as it clearly surprised Dr. Hayes. For 3 years, she had lived in shame and fear of official disapproval, but something fundamental had changed during that storm night in her cabin. "You're making a serious mistake, Dr. Mitchell. The medical board has a long memory, and we don't appreciate defiance from disgraced former practitioners." "Then perhaps the medical board should concern itself more with actual medical care and less with protecting its own authority," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. Dr. Hayes turned to leave, but paused at the edge of Sarah's porch. "You'll regret this attitude, Dr. Mitchell. The territorial government has ways of dealing with people who refuse to respect proper authority." After he rode away, Sarah stood in her doorway, feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified by her own boldness. She had essentially declared war on the medical establishment that had destroyed her career, but she had also affirmed her commitment to a higher calling than bureaucratic compliance. Eleanor arrived that afternoon to find Sarah still somewhat shaken by the morning's confrontation. When Sarah explained what had happened, Eleanor's reaction was immediate and decisive. "This changes nothing," she declared firmly. "On reservation, land, territorial medical boards have no authority. Dr. Hayes can make all the threats he wants, but he cannot touch you once you're under the protection of our tribal sovereignty." The concept of tribal sovereignty as protection had never occurred to Sarah, but Elena's confidence was reassuring. More importantly, the older woman's unwavering support in the face of official opposition demonstrated the depth of commitment the Apache community was making to their partnership. "Are you certain about this?" Sarah asked. "I don't want to bring trouble to your people." "The only trouble would come from abandoning someone who has already proven her worth," Elena replied. "Dr. Hayes represents the kind of thinking that values rules more than lives. We represent a different way of understanding what it means to heal." That evening, as Sarah continued packing her belongings for the move to the reservation, She reflected on how profoundly her life had changed since that storm night when desperate voices had called her back to her calling. The frightened, shame-ridden woman who had lived in self-imposed exile was being replaced by someone willing to challenge authority in service of a higher purpose. The confrontation with Dr. Hayes had clarified something important. Her choice wasn't simply between practicing medicine and not practicing medicine, but between two fundamentally different approaches to healing. The territorial medical establishment represented a system focused on credentials, regulations, and institutional authority, while the Apache community represented an approach focused on results, relationships, and service to those in need. Masadi Part 8, The New Beginning. Sarah's arrival at the Apache village was unlike anything she had expected. Rather than the primitive settlement she had unconsciously envisioned, she found a well-organized community that combined traditional Apache architecture with practical adaptations to their new circumstances on the reservation. The dwellings were arranged in family clusters around common areas, with larger structures serving community functions. Chief Thomas Blackhorse and Elena were waiting to greet her, along with what appeared to be most of the village's population. Children peered curiously from behind their parents, while elderly tribal members observed with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for important ceremonies. "Welcome to your new home," Thomas said formally, gesturing toward a modest but well-constructed adobe building that stood somewhat apart from the family clusters. "We hope it will suit your needs." Sarah approached her new dwelling with wonder and gratitude. The structure was larger than her old cabin, with separate areas for living quarters and what was clearly intended as a medical facility. The attention to detail was remarkable. Shelving built specifically for medical supplies, a large table suitable for examinations, even a separate entrance that would allow patients to access medical care without entering her private living space. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, running her hands along the smooth adobe walls. "When did you have time to build this?" Eleanor smiled with obvious satisfaction. "We began construction the day after you agreed to join us. Many hands make quick work, and everyone in the village contributed labor or materials." The realization that the entire community had immediately begun preparing for her arrival was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. These people had invested significant time and resources based solely on her promise to serve as their healer, demonstrating a level of trust that Sarah felt compelled to earn through her actions. Over the following days, Sarah began the process of establishing her medical practice within the cultural context of the Apache community. Elena served as both translator and cultural interpreter, helping Sarah understand not only the language barriers, but the complex social dynamics that influenced how tribal members approached healthcare decisions. "In our tradition," Elena explained, "as they organized medical supplies, healing is never a purely individual matter. Family members have important roles in the process, and community leaders may need to be consulted for certain types of treatment." Sarah found this communal approach to healthcare both challenging and enriching. Her training had emphasized the doctor-patient relationship as fundamentally private, but she was discovering that involving family and community members could provide valuable support for healing that went far beyond what she could offer alone. Her first official patient was an elderly man named Joseph Crow Feather, who suffered from what Sarah diagnosed as severe arthritis, complicated by what appeared to be diabetes. Joseph spoke no English, requiring Elena to serve as interpreter. Throughout the examination, the diagnostic process revealed the complexity of practicing medicine across cultural boundaries. Joseph's description of his symptoms, filtered through Elena's translation, included references to spiritual imbalances and family conflicts that Sarah's medical training had never prepared her to address. "He says the pain in his joints began," After his grandson was killed in a hunting accident, Elena translated, he believes his body is mourning in a way that prevents proper healing. Sarah found herself faced with a patient whose physical ailments were clearly connected to emotional and spiritual trauma in ways that conventional medicine rarely acknowledged. Her examination confirmed significant joint inflammation and elevated blood sugar, but she was beginning to understand that treating these symptoms without addressing their deeper causes would be inadequate. What would traditional Apache healing suggest for someone in his situation? Sarah asked Elena privately. Ceremony to help him release his grief, herbs to reduce the physical pain, and family involvement to restore his sense of connection to the community, Elena replied. The healing must address all aspects of his suffering, not just the body. Working together, Sarah and Elena developed a treatment plan that combined Sarah's medical knowledge with traditional Apache healing practices. Sarah provided medications to manage Joseph's diabetes and reduce joint inflammation, while Elena organized a healing ceremony that would allow him to properly mourn his grandson and receive community support for his recovery. The integrated approach proved remarkably effective. Within weeks, Joseph's physical symptoms began to improve, but more importantly, his overall demeanor changed from withdrawn despair to gradual re-engagement with community life. Sarah realized she was witnessing a type of healing that went far beyond anything she had been able to achieve through purely medical intervention. Word of Joseph's improvement spread throughout the village and beyond, bringing a steady stream of patients to Sarah's clinic. Each case presented unique challenges that required her to expand her understanding of what it meant to heal, but she found the work more fulfilling than anything she had experienced during her previous medical career. A particularly memorable case involved a young Apache woman named Star Dancing, who was experiencing complications during her pregnancy. Star Dancing's symptoms suggested preeclampsia, a potentially dangerous condition that required careful monitoring and possibly early delivery. However, Star Dancing's family was concerned that medical intervention might interfere with traditional birth practices that were considered essential for the baby's spiritual well-being. Sarah found herself needing to navigate between medical necessity and cultural sensitivity in ways that required creativity and diplomacy. Can we find a way to provide the medical care she needs while still honoring your traditions? Sarah asked Elena and Star Dancing's mother during a family consultation. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of thought that Apache people brought to healthcare decisions. Star Dancing's family wasn't opposed to medical intervention, but wanted to ensure that such intervention didn't conflict with their spiritual beliefs about childbirth and child-rearing. Working together, they developed a care plan that combined Sarah's medical monitoring with traditional Apache prenatal practices. Star Dancing would receive regular medical examinations to track her condition, but these would be supplemented with herbal treatments and spiritual ceremonies designed to support both mother and baby. The pregnancy progressed successfully, with Star Dancing eventually delivering a healthy son under Sarah's medical supervision, but within the context of traditional Apache birth practices. The successful integration of different healing approaches in such a critical situation cemented Sarah's reputation within the community as someone who could bridge medical worlds without abandoning either. As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly integrated into the daily life of the Apache village. Her role expanded beyond formal medical practice to include participation in community decisions about health and wellness, consultation on matters related to traditional healing practices, and even involvement in the education of young tribal members interested in healing arts. The children of the village were particularly fascinated by Sarah's medical equipment and procedures. She began holding informal educational sessions where curious young people could learn about anatomy, basic first aid, and the scientific principles behind various medical treatments. "You are planting seeds," Elena observed as they watched a group of teenagers practicing bandaging techniques. "Some of these young people will become healers themselves, carrying both our traditions and your knowledge into the future." The idea that she might be contributing to the development of future healers who could integrate multiple healing traditions was deeply satisfying to Sarah. She was beginning to understand that her role in the Apache community extended far beyond providing medical care to include mentoring and knowledge transfer that could benefit generations to come. Part 9. The Growing Threat. Sarah's peaceful integration into Apache community life was disrupted by news that reached the village on Datisana. A cold December morning, Daniel Swift Arrow rode in from one of his scouting trips with information that cast a shadow over their recent successes. "Dr. Hayes has been making inquiries," Daniel reported to Chief Blackhorse during a hastily convened council meeting that Sarah was invited to attend. "He's been asking questions in Cedar Ridge and at the territorial capital about your activities here on the reservation." Sarah felt the familiar clutch of anxiety in her chest, but it was different from the paralyzing fear she had experienced during her years of exile. Now she had a community that depended on her services, patients who needed her care, and a sense of purpose that gave her strength to face whatever challenges Dr. Hayes might present. "What kind of inquiries?" Thomas asked, his expression serious, but not panicked. "He's been trying to build some kind of legal case," Daniel replied, "talking to territorial officials about jurisdiction over medical practice on reservation land, questioning whether tribal sovereignty extends to licensing requirements for healthcare providers." Eleanor snorted with disdain. "That man has too much time on his hands if he can spend it harassing someone who saves lives instead of destroying them." Sarah appreciated Eleanor's support, but she was beginning to understand the seriousness of the threat Dr. Hayes represented. If he could convince territorial authorities to challenge tribal sovereignty over healthcare decisions, it could endanger not only her own ability to practice, but the Apache community's right to determine their own approach to healing. "There's more," Daniel continued reluctantly. "He's been spreading stories about dangerous medical practices and unqualified practitioners endangering Indian lives. Some of the territorial officials are starting to pay attention." The irony of Dr. Hayes' accusations was almost breathtaking. Sarah's integrated approach to healing had produced better outcomes for Apache patients than anything they had previously experienced, yet Hayes was characterizing her work as dangerous and unqualified. "What can we do to protect ourselves?" Sarah asked, directing her question to Thomas as the tribal leader. "Our sovereignty over internal tribal affairs is well established in federal law," Thomas replied thoughtfully. "But territorial officials sometimes try to overstep their authority, especially when they think they can act without federal oversight." The complexity of the jurisdictional issues was daunting, but Sarah was beginning to understand that her integration into the Apache community had provided her with protections she had never possessed as an isolated individual. The tribal government had both the legal authority and practical power to resist territorial interference in their internal affairs. Over the following weeks, the threat from Dr. Hayes continued to develop in ways that revealed both his persistence and his fundamental misunderstanding of what Sarah was actually doing in the Apache village. Reports reached the reservation of speeches he was giving to territorial medical societies, painting Sarah as a dangerous rogue practitioner who was exploiting vulnerable Indian populations. The characterization was so far from reality that it would have been laughable if the potential consequences weren't so serious. Sarah's practice had become a model of culturally sensitive healthcare that other reservation communities were beginning to inquire about. But Hayes was presenting it as a cautionary tale of medical malpractice. He's scheduled to address the T in territorial legislature next month, Elena reported after returning from a trading trip to a nearby town where she had overheard conversations about Hayes's campaign. He's asking them to pass legislation that would extend territorial licensing requirements to all medical practice within territorial boundaries, regardless of tribal sovereignty. The proposed legislation represented a direct attack on tribal self-governance disguised as a public health measure. If successful, it would not only end Sarah's ability to practice, but could severely restrict the Apache community's access to integrated healthcare approaches that had proven so beneficial. Sarah found herself facing a choice that would define not only her own future, but potentially the future of culturally integrated healthcare throughout the territory. She could quietly withdraw from practice to avoid the confrontation, protecting herself but abandoning the community that had given her purpose and meaning. Or she could stand and fight, risking everything on the principle that healing should be judged by results rather than credentials. The decision was made easier by a conversation with Maria Blackhorse, who visited Sarah's clinic with her now healthy baby son. The infant had thrived under the integrated care approach Sarah and Elena had developed, and Maria's own recovery from childbirth had been remarkably smooth. "Dr. Sarah," Maria said, using the informal title the village children had given her, "I know there are people trying to make trouble for you. I want you to know that if you hadn't been here that night, my son and I would both be dead. No law or regulation or territorial official can change that truth." The simple sincerity of Maria's words cut through all of Sarah's complex fears and uncertainties. She had been called to healing, not to satisfy bureaucratic requirements, but to save lives and reduce suffering. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental purpose. "What if we fight back?" Sarah asked Thomas during their next council meeting. "What if, instead of just defending our right to practice medicine this way, we actively demonstrate its effectiveness?" Thomas raised an eyebrow with interest. "What did you have in mind? What if we invited territorial officials to visit the reservation to see for themselves what we've accomplished? Let them meet patients who've been helped, observe our integrated approach in action, hear testimony from community members about the results we've achieved." Elena's eyes lit up with enthusiasm for the idea. Turn Dr. Hayes's attack into an opportunity to educate people about what healing can look like when different traditions work together. The strategy was bold and risky, but it offered the possibility of transforming a defensive battle into a positive demonstration of innovative healthcare. Rather than simply arguing for their right to practice medicine differently, they could show the superiority of their approach through concrete results. It could backfire, Thomas warned. If territorial officials come here determined to find fault, they might seize on any irregularity as justification for their interference. "But if they come here with open minds," Sarah countered, "they might see something that changes their entire understanding of what healthcare could be." The decision to invite scrutiny rather than hide from it represented a fundamental shift in Sarah's relationship with authority. Instead of the shame-ridden exile who had fled Cedar Ridge 3 years earlier, she had become someone willing to advocate publicly for her beliefs and practices. As winter deepened and the confrontation with territorial authorities loomed, Sarah threw herself into preparing for what could be the most important demonstration of her career. She began documenting case studies of patients who had benefited from integrated treatment approaches, gathering testimonials from community members, and working with Elena to develop presentations that could communicate the principles of their collaborative healing methods. The work was exhausting but energizing, fueled by a sense of purpose that had been entirely absent from her previous medical career. She was no longer simply treating individual patients, but pioneering an approach to healthcare that could benefit communities throughout the territory and beyond. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only Sarah's personal future, but the broader question of whether innovation and cultural integration could triumph over bureaucratic rigidity and prejudice. The stakes had never been higher, but Sarah had never felt more prepared to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. The territorial delegation arrived at the Apache reservation on a bitter February morning when the desert wind carried the promise of spring, but the ground still held winter's chill. Sarah watched from her clinic window as the official party dismounted their horses near the council lodge, their formal attire and rigid postures marking them as men unaccustomed to the rhythms of reservation life. Dr. Hayes led the group with the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was already assured. Behind him came Territorial Governor William Morrison, a political appointee whose understanding of frontier life came primarily from reports filed from the safety of his territorial capital office. Two additional officials completed the party: medical, Board Chairman Dr. Frederick Ashton, and legal counsel Robert Sterling, both men whose reputations for inflexibility preceded them. Chief Thomas Blackhorse greeted the delegation with the formal courtesy due to official guests, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful neutrality of his expression. This meeting would determine not only Sarah's future, but potentially the broader question of tribal sovereignty over internal healthcare decisions. "Gentlemen," Thomas said as the group assembled in the council lodge, "welcome to our community. We hope your visit will help you understand the importance of the medical services we have developed here." Governor Morrison stepped forward with the condescending manner of someone addressing children. "Chief Blackhorse, we appreciate your hospitality, but we're here on serious business. We have grave concerns about unlicensed medical practice taking place on your reservation, specifically involving a woman who has been barred from practicing medicine in this territory." The bluntness of the accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Sarah felt her pulse quicken with familiar anxiety, but she reminded herself that she was no longer the frightened exile who had fled Cedar Ridge years earlier. She had a community behind her now, evidence of success, and most importantly, the unshakable knowledge that her work was saving lives. Elena stepped forward from her position near the back of the lodge, her weathered face composed, but her eyes flashing with controlled anger. "Governor Morrison, before you make judgments about our medical care, perhaps you would like to meet some of the people whose lives have been improved by it." Dr. Hayes interjected sharply. "Mrs. Elena Morningstar," she replied with dignity that made his formal address sound petty. "I am the senior midwife and traditional healer for this community, and I work closely with Dr. Mitchell in providing comprehensive health care to our people." "There is no Dr. Mitchell here," Dr. Ashton declared with bureaucratic certainty. "There is only a disgraced former physician who lost her license after causing the death of an infant through medical negligence." The accusation struck like a physical blow, not because it was new, but because of the cruel satisfaction with which it was delivered. Sarah felt the familiar surge of shame and self-doubt, but before it could overwhelm her, Maria Blackhorse stepped forward carrying her now 6-month-old son. "You are wrong," Maria said clearly, her English accented but perfectly understandable. "This is my son. He is alive because Dr. Sarah delivered him during a terrible storm when no other help was available. Your licensed doctors were 50 miles away and could not have reached us in time. Without her skill and courage, we both would have died." Governor Morrison looked uncomfortable with this direct testimony, but Dr. Hayes pressed forward relentlessly. "One successful delivery doesn't negate years of proper medical oversight. This woman has no legal authority to practice medicine, and her activities here represent a dangerous precedent that could endanger lives throughout the territory." Thomas had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity, and now he stepped forward with the authority of a leader defending his people. Dr. Hayes, you speak of endangering lives, but you seem unaware of what has actually happened here. Since Dr. Mitchell began working with our traditional healers 6 months ago, we have seen dramatic improvements in community health outcomes. Would you like to hear the statistics? The offer clearly surprised the territorial officials, who had apparently expected to find evidence of medical malpractice rather than systematic health improvements. Thomas gestured to Elena, who produced a leather-bound ledger that Sarah had helped her maintain. Infant mortality has decreased by 70%, Elena read in her careful English. Maternal death during childbirth has dropped to 0. Cases of infection following injuries have been reduced by more than half. Deaths from diabetes and other chronic conditions have decreased significantly as patients receive both traditional remedies and modern medical monitoring. The statistics were impressive, but Dr. Ashton dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Unverified numbers from unqualified personnel have no medical validity. Proper healthcare requires trained physicians working within established protocols, not folk remedies administered by unlicensed individuals. Sarah had been listening to this attack on her work and the Apache healing tradition with growing indignation, and now she stepped forward to speak for herself. Dr. Ashton, with respect, your established protocols failed these people for generations. When was the last time a licensed territorial physician visited this reservation? When did your medical board last concern itself with the healthcare needs of Apache families? Dr. Hayes' face flushed with anger at Sarah's directness. You have no standing to question territorial medical policy, Miss Mitchell. You are a disgraced practitioner whose license was revoked for cause. My license was revoked because I made a mistake, Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. But I learned from that mistake, and I've spent the last year proving that healing requires more than credentials. It requires compassion, cultural understanding, and the wisdom to combine different approaches for the benefit of patients. Governor Morrison attempted to reassert control over the increasingly heated discussion. Regardless of outcomes, the law is clear. Medical practice within territorial boundaries requires proper licensing and oversight. Tribal sovereignty doesn't extend to ignoring territorial health regulations. It was Thomas who responded to this challenge, and his words carried the authority of generations of Apache leadership. Governor Morrison, our sovereignty absolutely extends to determining how we care for our own people. Federal law recognizes our right to self-governance in internal tribal affairs, and healthcare decisions are fundamentally internal matters. Legal counsel, Sterling stepped forward with the smug confidence of someone who believed he held the winning argument. Chief Blackhorse, tribal sovereignty has limits, especially when public safety is concerned. The territorial government has both the authority and responsibility to regulate medical practice to protect all residents. Whose safety are you protecting? The question came from Joseph Crow Feather, the elderly man who had been one of Sarah's first patients. Despite his limited English, he had clearly understood enough of the conversation to be deeply offended by the implications. Elena quickly translated his next words, spoken in rapid Apache. He says that before Dr. Sarah came to work with us, his diabetes was killing him slowly, and his arthritis made everyday agony. Now he manages his blood sugar with proper medicine, and his joint pain with both her treatments and our traditional remedies. He wants to know why men who have never met him think they know better than he does about his own health. The dignity and logic of the old man's question seemed to momentarily silence the territorial officials, but Dr. Hayes quickly rallied. Individual testimonials don't justify systematic violations of medical licensing laws. This reservation has become a haven for dangerous medical experimentation that puts vulnerable populations at risk. Sarah felt something snap inside her at the casual dismissal of her patient's experiences. Dangerous experimentation. Dr. Hayes, you want to see dangerous? Let me show you what passes for licensed medical care in this territory. She turned to address the entire assembly, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had found her true calling. When I practiced in Cedar Ridge with full territorial licensing, I was isolated from my patients' cultural backgrounds, forbidden from consulting with traditional healers, and pressured to treat symptoms rather than whole human beings. That approach led to the tragedy that destroyed my career, but it also taught me that credentials without wisdom are worthless. Sarah gestured toward Elena and the other Apache healers present. These women have knowledge passed down through generations about herbs, nutrition, spiritual healing, and community support that your medical schools don't teach. When I learned to work with them rather than dismiss them, my patients got better outcomes than anything I achieved with purely licensed practice. Dr. Ashton's response dripped with condescension. Primitive folk remedies may occasionally seem effective, but they can't replace scientific medical training. Your association with these practices only confirms your unfitness for legitimate medical work. Elena had been listening to this exchange with growing outrage, and now she stepped forward with the authority of her years and wisdom. Dr. Ashton, you call our healing primitive, but which of your licensed doctors has delivered over 200 babies without losing a single mother? Which of your scientific physicians understands how to treat diabetes with diet, herbs, and lifestyle changes that patients can actually afford? The challenge was direct and powerful, but Dr. Hayes attempted to deflect it. Anecdotal success stories don't constitute medical evidence. Proper healthcare requires controlled studies, peer review, and systematic oversight, none of which exists here. You want systematic oversight? Sarah asked, her voice rising with passionate conviction. Then why don't you examine our systematic results? Why don't you interview our patients about their experiences? Why don't you observe our integrated treatment approaches before condemning them? Thomas stepped forward to support Sarah's challenge. We invite you to stay for several days, to observe our healthcare practices in action, to meet with families who have benefited from integrated treatment. Judge our methods by their results, not by your preconceptions. The offer clearly made the territorial officials uncomfortable, as it threatened to complicate their simple narrative of dangerous, unlicensed practice. Governor Morrison exchanged glances with his advisors before responding. We appreciate the offer, but our concerns are legal rather than medical. The question isn't whether your treatments work, but whether they comply with territorial law. Sarah felt a surge of frustration at the governor's refusal to engage with the evidence, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice entered the conversation. Star dancing. The young woman whose pregnancy complications Sarah had successfully managed stepped forward, carrying her healthy 2-month-old daughter. Governor Morrison, she said in careful English, I am star dancing, Doctor. Sarah saved my life and my daughter's life when I developed dangerous sickness during pregnancy. Your licensed doctors would have taken me away from my family, forced me to give birth far from our traditions, separated me from the healing ceremonies. That helped my spirit stay strong. Dr. Sarah found a way to give me the medical care I needed while honoring our beliefs. Why do you want to take this choice away from Apache women? The young mother's eloquent plea seemed to resonate even with the territorial officials, creating a moment of uncomfortable silence. But Dr. Hayes, determined to maintain his attack, pressed forward with renewed intensity. These emotional appeals can't obscure the fundamental issue, he declared. Miss Mitchell is practicing medicine without a license, in violation of territorial law, and her activities set a dangerous precedent that could undermine medical standards throughout the region. Sarah had reached the limit of her patience. With Hayes's relentless hostility, Dr. Hayes, you keep talking about medical standards, but what standards are served by letting people die rather than receive help from someone whose only fault is lacking the right paperwork? What standards are served by ignoring treatment approaches that get better results than conventional medicine? The standards of professional accountability and public safety, Hayes replied sharply. Standards that exist to protect patients from unqualified practitioners who might cause harm through ignorance or incompetence. Like the harm I caused in Cedar Ridge, Sarah asked, her voice suddenly quiet but carrying clearly through the lodge. Is that what this is really about, Dr. Hayes? Not protecting Apache patients, but punishing me for a mistake I made years ago? The directness of her question seemed to catch Hayes off guard, and for a moment his professional composure slipped. Your past failures are certainly relevant to your current fitness for medical practice. My past failures taught me humility and the importance of working with others rather than in isolation, Sarah replied. They taught me to listen to patients and respect different healing traditions. They made me a better healer, even if they cost me my license. Eleanor stepped forward to stand beside Sarah, followed by Maria, Star Dancing, Joseph Crowfeather, and a growing number of community members who had benefited from the integrated healthcare approach. The visual impact of so many people willing to stand with Sarah was powerful and undeniable. Dr. Hayes, Eleanor said with quiet dignity, you can take away Dr. Sarah's license, but you cannot take away her knowledge, her compassion, or her commitment to healing. These things don't come from territorial boards, but from the heart of a true healer. Thomas moved to join the group supporting Sarah, his presence adding the weight of official tribal authority to their position. Gentlemen, you have seen the evidence of successful healthcare integration. You have heard testimony from patients whose lives have been saved and improved. You have been offered the opportunity to observe our methods firsthand. If you choose to ignore all of this in favor of rigid adherence to regulations that don't serve the people they're supposed to protect, then you're the ones failing in your responsibility. Governor Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, clearly recognizing that his delegation was losing the moral argument, even if they might win the legal battle. Chief Blackhorse, no one questions your people's right to traditional healing practices, but combining those practices with modern medicine requires proper oversight to ensure patient safety. We have proper oversight, Thomas replied firmly. We have Elena Morningstar, who has overseen births and healing in this community for 30 years. We have community elders who evaluate the effectiveness of treatments. We have Dr. Mitchell, whose medical knowledge is enhanced by, not replaced by, our traditional approaches. This is oversight that serves our people rather than distant bureaucrats. The confrontation had reached a critical moment where fundamental philosophies of healthcare and governance were in direct conflict. Dr. Hayes, recognizing that emotional appeals and practical evidence were working against his position, attempted to reassert legal authority. Regardless of outcomes or tribal preferences, territorial law is clear, he declared. Medical practice requires licensing, and unlicensed practice is subject to prosecution. We're prepared to pursue criminal charges if this illegal activity continues. The naked threat hung in the air like a thundercloud, but instead of intimidating the Apache community, it seemed to strengthen their resolve. Sarah felt the fear that had controlled her life for so many years finally breaking apart, replaced by something far more powerful, the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly the work she was meant to do. Dr. Hayes, she said clearly, if you want to prosecute me for saving lives, for respecting cultural traditions, for achieving better healthcare outcomes than your licensed system provides, then do it. But know that you'll be prosecuting someone, who has finally found her true calling as a healer. The declaration marked a transformation that went far beyond Sarah's personal journey. She had evolved from a broken exile fleeing her failures into a confident healer willing to challenge an entire system in defense of a better approach to medicine. The woman who had once hidden from her mistakes was now prepared to face any consequence. In service of her patients and principles, Elena stepped forward with the ceremonial dignity that marked important moments in Apache tradition. Dr. Hayes, Governor Morrison, you came here believing you would find dangerous medical practice threatening public safety. Instead, you have found a community where different healing traditions work together to serve human need. You have seen evidence of success that surpasses anything your licensed system has achieved for our people. You have witnessed the courage of a true healer who has learned from her mistakes and grown into something greater. She paused, letting her words settle before continuing with words that would be remembered long after the territorial officials had returned to their offices. We declare Dr. Sarah Mitchell to be a sacred healer, blessed by the spirits and honored by her patients. Your licenses and regulations have no power over such calling. Your threats cannot diminish such purpose. Your prejudices cannot overcome such truth. The formal declaration sent a profound silence through the assembly. Even Dr. Hayes seemed momentarily speechless in the face of Elena's spiritual authority and the obvious sincerity of her pronouncement. The territorial officials had come expecting to conduct a routine enforcement action, but they had instead encountered something far more complex and powerful. A community defending its right to determine its own approach to healing and honoring someone who had proven worthy of their trust. Thomas stepped forward to speak with the voice of official tribal authority. Governor Morrison, this concludes our presentation. Dr. Mitchell practices medicine on tribal land, under tribal sovereignty, with tribal approval, achieving results that serve our people's needs. If you choose to challenge this arrangement, you'll be challenging not just one woman, but the fundamental principle of tribal self-determination. The gauntlet had been thrown, and the territorial officials found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between backing down from their threats or escalating a conflict that could have far-reaching political consequences. Governor Morrison conferred quietly with his advisors while the Apache community waited with quiet dignity for their response. Finally, the governor stepped forward with the careful language of a politician seeking a face-saving compromise. Chief Blackhorse, while we have concerns about the precedent this situation might set, we recognize the complexity of healthcare delivery in frontier communities. We're prepared to refer this matter to federal authorities for clarification of jurisdictional issues rather than pursue immediate territorial action. The non-committal response satisfied no one completely, but avoided immediate confrontation. Dr. Hayes looked furious at what he clearly viewed as bureaucratic cowardice, while the Apache community understood that they had won a temporary victory that might or might not be sustained by higher authorities. But for Sarah, the governor's equivocation mattered less than the transformation she had undergone during the confrontation. She had faced her fears, defended her principles, and discovered that she possessed reserves of courage and conviction she had never known existed. Regardless of what federal authorities might eventually decide, she had reclaimed her identity as a healer and found a community that valued her contributions. As the territorial delegation prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes made one final attempt to intimidate Sarah. "This isn't over, Miss Mitchell. Federal oversight may be even more stringent than territorial regulation." Sarah met his gaze steadily, no longer the frightened exile he had confronted months earlier. "Dr. Hayes, I hope federal authorities will be wise enough to judge our work by its results rather than its paperwork. But whatever they decide, I've found my calling, and I won't abandon it to satisfy bureaucratic prejudices." Elena placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder as they watched the territorial officials mount their horses and begin their journey back to the capital. "You have proven yourself today, not just as a skilled physician, but as a woman of courage and principle. The spirits have indeed blessed you as a sacred healer." The formal recognition carried weight that transcended any governmental license or credential. Sarah had been accepted not just as a medical practitioner, but as someone whose healing work served a purpose larger than individual treatment. She had found her place in a tradition that valued wisdom, compassion, and results over bureaucratic compliance. As evening approached and the Apache community began to return to their normal routines, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had fled Cedar Ridge in shame and fear had been transformed. Through service, challenge, and the support of people who judged her by her actions rather than her credentials. Maria approached carrying her healthy son, now old enough to smile at familiar faces. "Dr. Sarah, today you stood up not just for yourself, but for all of us. You defended our right to choose our own healers and honor our own traditions. This is why we call you sacred, not because you're perfect, but because you're willing to sacrifice for others." The simple truth of Maria's words crystallized everything Sarah had learned during her time with the Apache community. Healing wasn't about avoiding mistakes or maintaining perfect credentials. It was about serving others with skill, compassion, and unwavering commitment to their well-being. Thomas joined them as the stars began to appear in the desert sky. "Whatever the federal authorities decide, you have a home here for as long as you want it. Your work has proven its value, and your courage has earned our permanent respect." Sarah looked around at the faces of people who had become not just patients, but family, people who had trusted her with their most precious responsibilities and been rewarded with care that honored both medical science and cultural wisdom. She had found something in this desert community that she had never experienced in her previous practice: the deep satisfaction of healing that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the whole person within their cultural and spiritual context. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying all the gratitude she felt for the chance to discover her true calling. "All of you have given me far more than I could ever give back." Eleanor smiled with the wisdom of someone who understood the cycles of giving and receiving that govern true healing relationships. "That's how healing works, Dr. Sarah. We all give what we can, and we all receive what we need. The spirits brought you to us when we needed your knowledge, and we gave you back your purpose when you needed healing for your own spirit." As the Apache community settled into evening routines, Sarah remained outside her clinic looking up at the vast desert sky. Somewhere in the territorial capital, officials were probably drafting reports about the day's events, and federal authorities would eventually render their judgments about jurisdictional boundaries and medical licensing requirements. But none of that seemed as important as the knowledge that she had finally found her place in the world, not as a licensed physician practicing conventional medicine in isolation, but as a sacred healer working within a community that valued both scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom. She had learned that true healing required not just medical expertise, but cultural sensitivity, spiritual awareness, and the courage to stand up for principles even when challenged by authority. The transformation was complete. The broken exile who had hidden from her failures had become a confident healer, willing to defend her calling against any opposition. The woman who had once feared human connection had found a community that honored her contributions and supported her growth. Most importantly, the doctor who had been trained to work in isolation had discovered the power of healing that integrated different traditions in service of human need. tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to demonstrate that healing could transcend the boundaries of convention and credential. Whatever the future held, Sarah Mitchell had found her true identity as a sacred healer, blessed by the spirits and honored by the people she served. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.